G'day, welcome back. I'm excited to share this video with you. This is 50 different compositional tips within this single photo we have here. 50 tips. We're going to get right into it. Want to know what they are? Let's go. So it is camera height. We talk about camera, the intersecting elements based on the camera height. Squeezing, expand the foreground. Asymmetrical balance, looking at my list here. Lighting, we talk about direction, strength, quality of lighting. Hard shadows, how that all affects where your eye goes in composition, side lighting, texture, reflections, atmospheric perspective, vertical versus landscape orientation. We also cover shooting towards space, which is a bit unusual for landscape, but that works with this one. There's also visual anchor, emphasis, dominance, try that again, emphasis and dominance. Focal points, hierarchy, off-center, rule of thirds, left to right, framing, positive space, active space, repetition and pattern, isolation, merges, juxtaposition. We're going to do a little bit of a deep dive on that one. Figure to ground, which is kind of like juxtaposition, proximity, which is unity and abundance, common fate, similarity, scale, lines, always got to include lines. So we've got leading lines, Borac and sinister lines, we've got diagonal lines, we've got horizontal lines, vertical lines, diminishing point, vanishing point perspective, triangles, golden spiral, Fibonacci spiral. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about foreground interest, obviously, layering, rhythm, time and motion, which is an interesting one, color contrast, which is again that juxtaposition, interaction, gesture. And then we're going to get into some areas that I think we could have improved a little bit with editing, and things that they've clearly done with this photo as well. So we're going to talk about border patrol, shadows, whether to lift it, whether to crunch the blacks, light flares, lens flares, and simplicity, removing elements. That's a lot, isn't it? That's 50 of them. Let's get straight into it. Now, I would love to say that I've researched all these tips just for this video, but that's not the case. I've put all these tips together in a course. It's a stronger photo composition 4-step system. As you know, I'm all about helping you create your next best photo using a systematic approach. So all these tips, and I've got 100 of them in this course and ebook with it broken down into 4 steps, and that's what we're going to break it down today. Step number 1, preparing and positioning yourself in the camera. Step number 2, positioning the main subject in the frame. Now, not every photo has a subject, but I'll talk about that later. Positioning different elements in the frame, how they all interact with each other. And then step number 4 is mobile editing. Now, editing is not something you normally associate with composition, but it is imperative that you enhance that viewer experience through the editing to try and control that visual flow of and the hierarchy of focal points and elements in the frame. So we're going to go right into that. All right, let's get into the photo. Here we go. So camera height, let's talk about that. Camera height, this photo was clearly taken at eye level. Now, you might think, okay, it's at eye level. Mike, you always tell us to take photos from an alternative angle, make it a bit more interesting. Eye level, everyone experiences life at eye level. It's boring. But in this photo here, that eye level does a couple of things. It makes sure that the horizon doesn't interrupt and dissect the boats. The boats don't go the other way around. The boats don't intersect and interrupt the horizon. Sometimes that can be good, and I'll talk about that later. But also at this height, it allows us to look into the boats to see some of that, the depth, and see some of the details of the boat. So it was appropriate to do that height there. The other thing it does here at that height is that it has made the photo 2/3. Now I get to draw on here. 2/3 of the frame is the water level. Now, if we took this photo from a lower level, then it could be 50% water, 50% sky. So what it's done here is by placing that, by shooting at that height, we've expanded the foreground. That makes sense? Alrighty, let's move on. Asymmetrical balance. By shooting at this position, we've also created balance. Now, if I look here, that is like a big block. This is like another big block. Okay, and the space in between, it's created balance in the image. So if we crop that differently, and say they cropped it like that, not so much balance. Or if they cropped it, it's a bit hard because I can't zoom in here. If they cropped it like that, not so much balance. So you can see there, the visual weight of those main elements has created balance there. So that's asymmetrical balance, because symmetrical balance is where you can split it down the middle, horizontal, vertical, and then you've got the same either side. But this is not split and mirrored. Okay. Lighting. Lighting in composition. Of course, that's important. And here we can see a lot of lighting. We've got the sun and we've got the reflection of the sun. So that's quite a bit of light there. So that has attracted our eye because it's bright. Our eye is attracted to bright things, vivid things, things that are sharp in focus or contrast. All these things attract our eye. So the light here in this photo pulls our attention to the eye. But also the lighting, the angle of the lighting has also meant that the areas inside the boat are well lit. Certain areas, they probably went and did a little bit of dodge and burn, darken and brighten little areas locally with the editing, which would be brilliant. Looks like they've done that, because you can see here inside there, that's probably not so well lit because that should be a bit of a shadow cast in there. So they might have gone and dodged that, brought that up a bit. Now, I'm going to throw in an extra tip here, just in case you're watching this video and you're going to go, hey Mike, you said there's 50 tips, but there's not. You only gave me 49. Well, I'll give you a bonus one here. So this, and I'll talk about this one soon, is the rule of thirds. Okay, rule of thirds, breaking it down. This one here is 1/3, 2/3. So this 1/3 we've got here on the right, and then we've got 2/3 as filled up with the light, that light source. So that's 1/3, 2/3. All right, just throwing an extra one there. I get distracted like this. Alrighty, next we're going to talk about side lighting. Yes, that side lighting there has brought out the texture and the details, creates depth. And that depth is really hard to create in a two-dimensional image. And if we can do that through techniques like side lighting to bring out the texture and depth and shadows, all that sort of thing, that adds to the composition, because you're creating depth, you're making it look like layered and that sort of thing. Alrighty, next one we're going to cover is reflections. Now this photo really doesn't have many reflections. I'll get myself out of the way. But what we do have is we have the reflections here of the trees. Okay, not too much. What I love about this photo is these reflections here. Okay, the way this is being composed is that we can see the sky there, and we can see the reflection of the sky there. But this area here down the bottom, where we've got this reflection of the clouds, those soft clouds that the boats kind of look like they're sitting on, we can't actually see that above that tree line. So we've created that element of mystery, and I'll throw in an extra bonus one here. This is a design technique called closure. So our brain can't see those fluffy clouds above the tree line there, but our brain subconsciously has closed that off and gone, oh yeah, there's the shadows, there's the reflection, I should say, of stuff that I can't see. So your brain has filled that gap. All right, enough on that one. Let's move along. I've got 50 of these to get through. Next one is atmospheric perspective. So this is where you look out into a scene and you notice that, you know, it's like you look out in the distance and everything becomes hazy and faded and less contrast and less detail. That has happened naturally with this photo because of the lens selection. And you can see here, this is what I'm talking about. It's gone faded there. So that has created that depth. Now, if they changed the lens and they went for a telephoto lens, or depending on the smartphone they're using, they could have used a 2x, 3x inbuilt lens, then what that does is that actually brings the background closer and you don't have that diminishing scale perspective because you've flattened the image and you've brought that. It's just the way it works. It brings it all back closer, that background elements closer to the foreground elements. So that has worked really well there for that diminishing scale perspective. All right, next one. Get breath. Getting through these quickly. Your time is valuable. All right, next one I want to cover here is vertical and horizontal. Decide, am I going to take this as a vertical photo or am I going to take this as a horizontal photo? Here, the horizontal has worked brilliantly because you fit everything in. Sometimes a vertical, you need to fit everything in. You might want to get all those trees, more of those trees up in the top. You might want to get more stuff in the bottom, and a vertical might have been appropriate. But here the landscape works really well. Shooting towards space. Now, shooting towards space is something we kind of associate with real estate photography and interior photos, where You'll sit in one corner of the room and you'll shoot out into the open area. And that creates space, that creates context. It does lots of things. It evokes the imagination of the person. It has breathing room for your eye to move around. So shooting into space is always really well. And you can see here, all these boats are kind of heading in, and you've got all that space ahead of it. And I'll expand on that a little bit more when I talk about space. But we're going to talk now briefly about the step number 2, which is positioning the main subject in the frame. Now, for most people, this is all they do with composition. And with this 4-step system that I have, basically I've touched on that, where you position yourself, or prepare yourself and the camera, where you position all those, where you position the subject that we're going to get into now, where you position the elements, and editing. If you can do 1 or 2 in each of those 4 steps, all of a sudden you've got 8 different compositional techniques that you've put in there. And can you imagine if you had just one and you do, okay, rule of thirds, great, looks really good, got off center, looks lovely. But if you do rule of thirds and then you apply leading lines, you apply asymmetrical balance, you apply all these different things that we've already talked about yet, but you include a couple of them from each of there, all of a sudden you're compounding that the impact of that composition. So it makes a massive difference. And I'm excited for you to have a look at that. So positioning the subject in the frame. A couple of questions before we do. To achieve this, what is the main subject? What is the hero of the image? What is the visual anchor? Where do you want their eye to go first? That is what the main subject is. It doesn't have to be a person, a boat. It doesn't have to be something, but in this occasion, it is a boat. Okay, so for me, when I'm looking at the visual anchor here, this is the visual anchor for me. So that's the main subject, is that boat. It could be the main subject is all of the boats. Okay, there's no right and wrong here, but it's where you, as a photographer and photo editor, where you want the eye to go straight away. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. Emphasis and dominance. So that area that you want that person to go to, it has to have some sort of emphasis, something that attracts the eye. Here for me, that bright and that contrast of the blue, and I'll talk about that shortly, that pops for me. And then from there, I go exploring, I come around, okay? And then when I further look into it, I go, oh yeah, cool, and that brings me around. So you can see the visual flow for me. I would love for you to put in the comments down below. Let me know what area picks up your eye first. When you look at this photo, what is it? What elements do you look at first and next? And that's what I want you to think about is, okay, I've gone there. Now I've gone here, here, and we'll talk about a few different ways that this person who took this photo has controlled that. Sounds very manipulative, doesn't it? Controlling your attention. But that's what it is. It's called hierarchy. So all these different focal points have a hierarchy. That's what we're talking about here. So it's going from one to the next to the next. Okay, a couple of quick ones here. Rule of thirds, we touched on that one. So basically you already know about this one. So that is splitting the board into a tic-tac-toe board, splitting it up into 9 squares. Basically you want to have, this is the guideline. It's called the rule of thirds, but it's just a guideline. Like all of these, a lot of them contradict each other, so don't worry, don't get hung up on it. It has to always have the horizon on that line there. But you can see there, we touched on this earlier, the horizon there, you got 2/3 of the photo is the water. So we know, hey, this photographer wants us to concentrate on the photo, not so much the sky. Okay, so that's what you've done there. And then if you have another focal area that you want the people to pay attention to, you place that on one of the other vertical lines. So that's what that is. That's the rule of thirds. So what that does, it effectively places the main focal points off center. You don't want things smack bang in the center. And why do you think that is? Why do you think we don't want to put the main subject in the middle of the frame? It becomes static. We kind of look at it, and if there's nothing else going on around it, we kind of look at it, get fixed on it. That point of fixation is the center of the frame. We look at it and go, oh yeah, cool. All right, next photo. And you just move on. And by having things off center, what it does is it encourages you to look over there. And then because there's so much space around it, you just instinctively go, okay, yep, cool. What else is here? And you go looking around. And that has encouraged, I know there's a term for it. I've forgotten it. There's the term for your eye to kind of twitch and move around and be curious. And so that's what we're trying to achieve there by having things off center. And that's where the rule of thirds works, because if you have things on these lines, okay, then they are off center, and that's what you are trying to achieve. Another really cool technique here is left to third. Left to right, left to right. So basically, if you can imagine, you're walking out the front of your door, okay, you're out front of your house, you walk out, where do you look? Okay, we look we look down where our feet are so we don't trip over something. We look and we scan from left to right. Now, different cultures, you might read text from top to bottom, right to left. Most of us read from left to right, and that's how we scan a scene, and that's how we scan a photo. So if we can place focal points to the left, okay, here, and then encourage the person to look to the right, what it does is it has less mental load on us, okay? A photo that has visual tension is a photo that interrupts and makes us think, subconsciously take a little bit longer to process what's going on. But if you want to have an aesthetically pleasing photo, having something that moves from left to right is easier for someone to break down quickly and view it and interpret and understand what's going on. Something that has a flow that goes the other way just causes that little bit extra thinking time. So that's left to right. Next, we have framing. This is beautiful. I love it. It's so obvious, isn't it? There, look at that. The picture is framed. By having that overhanging tree, yes, you could have cropped that and cropped that out and gone like that. It had no horizon, it just had the boats. And that's really nice, but that provides so many things we've already talked about. That atmospheric, aerial perspective, diminishing point. It has so many things there. The blue sky adds to it. Yes, that would be a simpler scene and then your attention becomes something else, and the focal point, the story becomes something else. Whereas here, this is clearly a lake. You can tell the context. So this tells more of a story. And that framing kind of frames the story. You like that? Right. So the next one I wanted to talk about is space. And there's a couple of examples here. Space, when you think about space in photos, you've got positive space, negative space, active space. So we're going to talk about those really briefly. Positive space is the area that the subject, content, focal points take up here. And you can see here, we've got all these boats here, all that. Even the clouds here, tree line, there's a lot going on with that positive space. Negative space is the space that is void of anything. So it doesn't have anything going on. So these are all those. Okay. Now this photo is quite busy and I like that. It works really well. We don't always have to have simplistic photos to be aesthetically pleasing. Here we have active space as well. And I love this with this. Having all this space for these boats to move into. If this was cropped, and I'm not going to be able to do it, I think. Okay, if it was cropped like that, that doesn't have active space. Yes, there's plenty of negative space behind the boats, but because the boats are pointing the other way, you don't have active space. And that active space, again, creates that visual aesthetic that is not, doesn't have that visual tension. You know, that framing like that has visual tension. Things are cut off. You can't see ahead of them. There, that active space works really well. All right, so I'm going to introduce a couple of design elements in this that work really well in this photo. And based on the Gestalt theory, it's well known. There's like 11 different principles in that theory, but a couple here apply really well. And basically, it is about helping the viewer chunk things down and interpret really quickly, interpret the photo, interpret the scene, the frame really quickly. Okay, and this one here that I'm going to talk about is repetition and pattern. So you can see here, because these boats are all lined up, okay, they're all lined up. When we first look at that, we go, oh yeah, boats, lake, tree, blue sky. We don't think boat number 1, boat 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We don't think like that. We kind of chunk them all together. And that's what we've done here, is we're chunking it. And that repetition and pattern creates one main element. So it makes it really easy for us to interpret that scene. Now you can see here, we do have some isolation though within that. With this boat here, I love this blue boat. This one really works for me because it's isolated. There's no merging of areas. Like here, if we look over here, these ones kind of overlap, they merge. Okay, they all touch each other, they all merge, becoming one chunk, one element, whereas these two boats over here are isolated. But this one here in the corner, the shadow hits the edge of the frame. So it doesn't stand out as much as this blue one. That's a really isolated, quite isolated, that blue one. And these little buoys there that they float on, they attach to, they're isolated. So that isolation kind of grabs your attention and makes it stand out a little bit. Now, merges are good, and I like that. But you can see there, now that I've pointed out, you probably see it a lot clearer now. Okay. Now, the next one I want to talk about is juxtaposition. And that isolation is an example of juxtaposition. So basically, juxtaposition is visual contrast. Okay. And the simplest way I can explain contrast is the difference between two things. Okay. You got two things that are different. Okay. So one is smaller than the other. One is facing you. One is, one's facing you, one's not. They're different. Height, one's small, one's shorter, one's higher. One's more in focus, one's out of focus. Then this contrast is the difference between the two. And the bigger the difference, the bigger the contrast. And that's what juxtaposition basically is. So you could have, and this is where having a blurred background works really well. You got that juxtaposition and your eye doesn't go to that blurred background. So it can be shape, color, it can be anything. And the juxtaposition here, we've got quite a few. We've got the green foliage up the top here. We've got the blue, that's a juxtaposition, contrast. Again, we've got mustard and blue. It's a contrast. We've got sharp details, and then we've got sharp details, and then we've got the haze in the background there. So we have quite a few different juxtapositions here. We have the diminishing scale that I talked about earlier with the large boat. And as they go further away, they look smaller. So all this juxtaposition helps elements pop and stand out of the photo. Alrighty, we're going to move into step number 3 now, which is positioning all the supporting elements and focal points in the frame. So next one here is figure to ground. So basically, the figure is the main emphasis, the main focal point, the fixation point, the main subject. That's called the figure, and then ground is the background. Now, an example, if you can think of this, an example of a figure to ground that's unstable, doesn't work, is you take a photo of a brick wall. Okay, take a photo of a brick wall. It's all got repetition and patterning, and it's got all these things going for it, but there's no clear focal point. There's nowhere to look at it. So you just go, oh yeah, brick wall. But if you put a person in front of the brick wall, all of a sudden that person is the figure and the background is the brick wall. So that's where you have the figure to ground. So you got that. Just another example of juxtaposition. All right, and we're going to talk about a couple more elements inside the Gestalt theory. Proximity, we're going to talk about that. It's unity and abundance. So you hear all these boats are creating unity. They're in abundance. There's lots of them. Like I said before, with the mergers, it creates one visual element, one thing to look at. Also, common fate, because these are all facing the same way, it links them all together. Even though you have a couple that are isolated, different colors, there's some contrast between them. One will stand out more than the other as they merge, as they get further away and they get smaller, less noticeable, but they're all still one complete element in the frame because they have that common fate. They're all pointing the same way, and that's what makes this really strong. If you had one boat, pointing the other way, that's a really bad drawing. If you have one boat pointing the other way, all of a sudden it kind of pops in and creates that visual tension. It's like, oh, okay, so that's not like the rest of them. So that similarity, that common fate. Scale, talked about diminishing scale, which is really handy to create depth, but also having some elements in there within a certain focal point, a certain distance from the camera, helps us to understand how big it is. Now, we all know how big a boat is, but having the boat there on its own, we might not be that familiar with whatever the subject is, but by having something in there like these little sticks in the water, we all know how big a pole is. Okay, having this foliage here, we all kind of know, just general knowledge, we know how big leaves of trees are. So having items in there, this is where having a person in a photo works really well because we all know how big a person is, and that provides that scale. So there's certainly a lot of elements in here that provide that visual cue to provide that scale. All right, lines is the next one we're going to talk about. Now lines, so many different ones. Here we're going to talk about diagonal lines and how they work, why they work, horizontal line, vertical line, leading line, implied line of sight. So we can talk about those ones. So let's get straight into the leading line. So here for me, like I mentioned before, my eye goes to here and then it goes around here. So that creates a leading line. Now you might look at this differently. You might go, oh yeah, there's a boat. And then your eye might go to here. Or you may you might look in the shadows and you go, there's a leading line there. So there's lots of different lines and visual flows. Horizontal line, it's not always a great leading line because a horizontal line creates it cuts it off. And if you have this photo framed and it was in the center there, it kind of really cuts it off. But a horizontal line also provides a reference point for depth. So if you have these boats were all lined up and the tips of the boats were all in a line here, that creates a horizontal line. And then you have the horizon with the diminishing perspective, all that sort of thing. They provide depth and layering. Okay. I think that's a bonus one. I don't think layering was in my list of 50. Okay. Vertical lines create stability. Okay. Having these lines creates stability in the frame. And if there's something in there that we know should be vertical and it's not vertical, then that creates a bit of visual tension, a bit of interest. So that stability is what those ones do. Okay, diagonals, really interesting one. Okay, like I mentioned, when we walk out of our front door, we look down the bottom and then we look to the right. Okay, now if we look down and we and then that goes that way, that diagonal. That's called a Barak diagonal. Okay, free flowing, the way we're used to. Now, if we have something in here, a line that goes the other way, this is called a sinister diagonal. A little bit more visual tension, depending which way you're going from top, left. Now, depending on your experience, your culture, then the way you look through a photo is differently. But that's how the diagonals work. Diagonal is more dynamic. It's not dissecting the photo. It's kind of flowing through the photo a little bit more. All right, another one here is the implied line of sight. So even though these are all pointing here and there's no line going to there, we kind of look there, don't we? This is actually encouraging us to look. And because they're all pointing the same way, they have the common fate, similarity, they're all pointing there, then that has our eye. You cannot resist. You have to look. It's like if you've ever done this, you're driving along and you see people at an intersection, they're all looking up. You can't help it. You need to look up. that implied line of sight is like, what are they looking at? And you've seen those photos of photographers in a frame and you can see them in the corner taking a photo and then your eye just goes, oh, what are they taking a photo of? So that's what the implied line of sight is. Converging lines, also known as vanishing point, diminishing perspective. So many different ways of putting it here. These boats are all positioned. They're all heading to that same location. So it's kind of a bit of like a railway line. You stand in the middle of a railway line or a road and things just get more narrow as you go along. And that kind of leads to triangles. Triangles, there's so many different triangles in here. Each of these boats has a triangle in the front of it. Okay? All of them together creates a triangle. Now you can see here, all these triangles are on a bit of an angle. If you have a triangle that is shaped like that, because the base is horizontal, it's stable. No, not boring, but it's strong. Okay, but here we've got triangles everywhere, and all these triangles create, because they're all on a bit of an angle, they're a bit more dynamic. But there's lots of triangles in this, which is hard to achieve in a landscape photo. All right, next we're going to talk about Fibonacci spiral, golden spiral. They're both slightly different. One, and you can see here the bottom of the curve, you can see here they both start off with a rectangle shape. One is based on squares and the other rectangle shape is based on the Fibonacci sequence. Okay, so that is your starting point. That's how you crop it. You can't apply this spiral to a square photo. It has to start off with one of these rectangles. So you can see here, and this works really well. The boats follow that curve, that sweeping curve, and go around. And we've got stuff there, and you come back, and we've just missed that sun. So to make this technically perfect, then you would move the sun, or you move your feet, would be a lot easier, so that you've got the sun more closer to the center of the frame to complete that circle. Now, most people, when they use Lightroom or camera overlay, or however they've got that overlay presenting, they don't quite understand that you've got to have, it's not just a matter of at the end of the spiral, this is the spot where you place your main focal point. you need to have focal points along those lines to make that flow work. It's not about the placement at the end of it. It's about the flow. Okay. So next I'm going to talk about golden triangles really quickly. This is what the golden triangle is. You have your main angle, your main from point to point angle, and then you have other elements positioned along these other two lines, and these intersecting lines need to be at 90 degrees. So that's the golden triangle. Now, to be a Borac angle, you don't necessarily need to have it at 90 degrees. So 90 degrees is boom and bang, but a Borac, that's the golden triangle. But it could also be, okay, this is not quite right. I want to have that as the main focal point pointing up there. Okay, and then I'll have another main focal point over here, and then that's facing and pointing that way. Doesn't necessarily have to be so rigid that it's exactly 90 degree angle line. Alrighty, moving along. Next one, foreground interest. I know, pretty simple, but having foreground interest doesn't necessarily have to be the main subject in a frame. You can have the main subject, but then to add another focal point that has a less emphasis, less lower in the hierarchy, you can have other focal points in the foreground. Like here we have this here. We've got a little foreground interest there. You know, it's not the main part of the photo, but we've got something in there. So when we talk about foreground interest, doesn't necessarily need to be the main thing. Rule of odds. Interesting one. Rule of odds. As things happen out in nature, as more often than not, they are an odd number. If you have something that is in pairs, 2, 4, 6, 8, kind of starts to feel rigid. So if we look here, we break down these into our main elements. We've got 1, 2, maybe that's 3. Okay, breaking down those main form into sections. If you've got an odd number, that's fantastic. How many boats we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. But if I zoom in, have a look, there's actually 8, 9. Because they merged and that diminishing perspective, I don't see it. But we've got 9 boats, so that worked out really well. So that's the rule of odds, have an odd number. Layering, distance to camera, we talked about this earlier. This pole is the closest. This boat, then these boats, then the tree, then that. You can tell with this photo the way things have been composed and positioned in the frame based on the camera height and lots of other things we've talked about. It has that layering in there, that distance to camera. This is an interesting one, is rhythm, time and motion. Now you're thinking, Mike, this is a still image. This is two-dimensional photo. How are you talking to me like you teach me how to play the piano? So we want to talk about this is if we look through and we scan through this scene, okay? And like I said, my eye goes here and it goes around there, okay? Now, when I look at this scene and I interpret this scene, I'm not looking at it in a steady pace going scan, okay, done. Yeah, it doesn't work like that. I'm looking through it. Okay, scanning quickly, slow down. Oh, it's interesting. And then, oh yeah, oh, what's that? And then that is the pace. That's the time, the rhythm. Okay. Now, if we look back at the photo here, okay. So for me, that's 1 to there, 2 to there, oh, maybe to there. And then I go, oh, that's interesting. It's isolated. Okay. Okay. And then I look to there. So that's interrupted the flow. And a perfect example is if I had a boat along here, and I'm going along there and go, oh, there's something along there, and it's interrupted my visual flow. That is where you can change that rhythm. So you could have a series of items. You know, this works really well for panoramics, where somebody scans from left to right, and they've got quite some time to scan through the whole photo to take it all in. You could have someone go, oh, yeah, dump, 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 dump. That's a pretty lame explanation, but that's the best one I've got. So that's how I understand it. It's a pattern interrupt. It's something that kind of go flow, 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 flow. Oh, what's that? Oh yeah, bang, and you move along. So that's what that's all about. We talked about juxtaposition quite a bit. We talked about shape, form, sharpness, color. We talked about color. So I'm going to go into that a little bit more now with the color. There's an amazing free website, color.adobe.com, so C-O-L-O-R, not O-U-R, the way we spell it here in Australia. So it's color.adobe.com, and you can upload a photo like I have here. And then you can let it by default, it'll select the main colors, or you can drag these pins around and go, okay, these are the colors that I want to understand. And then you can go over to the color wheel, and this is brilliant. We can look at this color wheel and go, these are the main colors. And here you can see what we have. It's a split complementary colors. It's also a triad if we want to get complicated. Basically, we've got three main colors that all contrast against each other. Pretty cool, isn't it? So then you can see here, even with this photo that is quite muted, okay, muted with colors, there's still contrast. There's contrast between the green and the blue and the mustard and the blue. If we look at this here, you can see there, the mustard, the green, the blue, they're the three main colors in this photo. All right, there's a couple more I want to cover here on in this step of the four-step system, and that is gesture and interaction. Interaction, cover that first, is how the main subject, something in there, and how it's interacting with the environment, how it's interacting. So you can see here, the boats are sitting on a still lake. The lake's not moving, so that's how it's interacting, and that's where we've got the reflections. So that's interaction. Gesture is how each of those has something unique about it. So how it's gesture, what it's doing. So it's like when you think of gesture, you think of someone's hands, you look at their facial expression. So something that makes them different from everyone else. So with the boats here, this covering, that's a gesture. This is more of a gesture. This line going across here. The way, this is the best one. These oars, the way the oars are sitting on the boat there, that's a gesture. It's a moment in time that makes that unique. Okay, so we're going to move into step number 4 of the 4-step system. This is the mobile editing. Now, I didn't take this photo. This was a photo of a stock photo of Pixabay. And so using this system, you can go and dissect any of those photos and go through this process yourself. It's a lot of fun. First one I want to start with here is border patrol. That's where we go around the border and we go, okay, is there anything on the edges that is pulling my attention away from it? You can see here the sun, it's got a bit of space around it, so that's really good. Going along the border there, really nice. No issues. Oops, just drew on the photo there. This one here, yeah, that might be something. If it was bright and a bit more texture to it, it might stand out and pop, but it's okay. Moving along, this point here, this little bit here in the water, I probably want to get rid of that. So that's border patrol. That's one way of controlling your viewer's attention and stopping it going out. The other is vignette. And you can see here, there's definitely been a vignette applied to this photo because you can see here it's darker around that part of the frame. Okay, not so much up there, although it does look a bit darker, but it's clearly a vignette. And the vignette, as you know, again, pulls your attention back into the photo. It stops the person from looking out of the frame yeah, works really, really well. Shadows is another thing. You can see here, I think inside there, I reckon they've gone and lifted the shadows inside there. So they've done that locally to pull your attention there, because you can see the light source is from here. And I would say that would cast a bit of a shadow inside there. So they've lifted the shadows there. Other areas here, they might have gone and locally, when I say locally, area specifically, might have gone and just reduced the shadows there and crushed those blacks. And that becomes a bit of mystery, bit of, I don't need to see in there, I want to look somewhere else. So you're kind of controlling that. So there's been a bit of work done to the shadows and the blacks in this photo. Lens flares, now this sun, yeah, that's the way it was captured. I think you could use PixArt, free, available on iOS and Android, or Lens Light on the iPhone. You can go and you can add a little bit of an overlay and create a bit more of a starburst and make that look really nice. Even add a bit of a lens flare maybe if it adds to the story. So there's a couple of options there. And lastly is removing objects. Now, I talked about that one, removing that, but there might be other little areas there where you might go, you know what, that's pulling my attention. It's not adding to the story. So there's elements that are not adding to the story. You can just go in there and you can just clean it up and go, okay, you know what, that one there doesn't need to be there. And we might get rid of that area there. So we're simplifying the scene. Less distraction, makes it more aesthetically pleasing for the many reasons that we've talked about already. So we've gone through 50 of them. So what I'm going to do now is just go through a real quick run through all these tips now that we've talked about. I'm going to read them out to you. Ready for this? So step number 1, camera height. We talked about Intersecting background elements by changing the height. We talked about squeezing and expanding the background. Asymmetrical balance. Lighting, we talked about direction, strength, quality, shadows, side lighting, textures, how that all affects the depth, reflections, atmospheric perspective. Based on a lens choice, we can just squash the background, bring the background forward, or have the background disappear. Vertical and landscape orientation, shooting towards space. Then we moved into step number 2, which was visual anchor, where the eye lands. So the point of fixation point. Emphasis, dominance, focal points, the hierarchy, off-center, rule of thirds, left to right, framing, positive space, active space, repetition and pattern, isolation, merges, juxtaposition with colors, tones, textures, height, shape, size. So many different things you can contrast. Then we moved into step number 3, figure to ground, proximity, which is unity and abundance, common fate, similarity, scale, lines. We talked about horizontal lines, vertical lines, diagonal, differences with diagonal lines. We talked about implied line of sight, converging lines, vanishing, diminishing point. We talked about triangles, Fibonacci spiral, golden spiral. We talked about rhythm, time, motion, color contrast. So we had triadic and split complementary there, gesture, interaction. We talked about the editing then, border patrol, vignetting, removing items, and blacks, shadows, crushing them, and lens flares, how you can add to an existing photo. I'm out of breath. I've really lost my voice as well. That's heaps. So thank you again for joining me. That was quite a lot. We covered 50 different tips. We covered more than 50, but that's what's in the thumbnail. So there's 50 tips there. That's the link down below. Please comment. Let me know which ones you weren't aware of, which ones you might even challenge me on some of them, which is fantastic. Please do. I can always update the course and the ebook. Links below. Catch you again soon. Bye-bye.